NICO for 5 years. So this is going to be my last year, so I'm going to move to another university. NICO is very special, and NICO cares about complex systems and also cares about interdisciplinary studies. So I have the honor to meet a lot of great scientists from a different domain, from biology, chemistry, physics. So when we're talking about interdisciplinary, we're always talking about interdisciplinary collaborations. So we care about the same issue on the same level, and we collaborate on that. Social scientists care about the causality or the causation between different variables. Physics models care about how to use like a minimal model to capture the system. The computer science cares about how to do a prediction. So we care about the same issue from the same level, and this is somehow we call that horizontal. But there's another kind of interdisciplinary interesting. So it's called vertical interdisciplinary. So basically, that we care about the same issue from different levels, and in each of the levels with different methodologies. This is very hard because most of us we have a very limited attention. We cannot explore all of the domains. And if you have one scholar working like this, that would be fantastic. And I believe Tessa belongs to this kind of a category. So she wanted to use different methodologies from time series and LP, big data, experimental, all of these methodologies to understand how human thought and feelings change over time and with immediate and external forces. So this is quite fascinating, and it's very rare that you can find someone with these goals. But you should talk to give us a lot of insight. With that,
oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much. That was such a generous introduction. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm brand new to Kellogg, and this is such a wonderful welcome. It also means that I'm ripe for collaboration and really excited to hear all of your thoughts and your feedback. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that over the past few years, there has been nothing more certain in our lives than change. Change is not just a quirk of the past few years, though, or even of just the 2020s. Change is really part of what it means to be human, what it means to live and interact and adapt to our human societies. So as a researcher, as Jing mentioned, I'm really focused on understanding one specific part of this change. So specifically how and why we change in our attitudes and our stereotypes about the myriad social groups that make up our surrounding. So how is it that our society on average is changing in what it thinks and feels about the people around us? How is it that individual minds are updating in response to new information as well? So these questions of change in our attitudes and our stereotypes have been at the center of our fields in the social sciences for decades. And over this time, we've documented clear evidence that people can and do change what they think and feel about the world around them. Consider, for instance, two examples. Number one, in 1946, a mere third, about 35%, thought that men and women were equally intelligent and equally competent. Today, that number is higher, although still not at 100%, about 86%. Similarly, we can see change in what we think and feel about racial groups. For instance, in the 1950s, a mere 4% of white Americans thought that Black-white marriages were permissible. Today, 94%. So for just those two examples, it's clear that our society can and does evolve in what it thinks about the people around it. But what's really interesting is more broadly, when we think about our research program on change in our attitudes and our stereotypes, it's not just a matter of documenting where change does and does not happen. It's really going to tell us something about the features of our minds and our societies. And that is because just in measuring attitudes and stereotypes, we get out a compressed quantitative indicator of what I would call the kind of thumbprint of the culture on our mind. So it tells us a little bit about what in our society is impinging and influencing our mind, right? Just by measuring our attitudes and stereotypes, we can understand this diffuse idea of a culture. It also tells us a little bit about one determinant of our behavior. So if we're interested, for instance, in hiring discrimination, understanding attitudes and stereotypes that people hold can tell us about where some of those behaviors might come from. So measuring attitudes and stereotypes is really important. Measuring change in our attitudes and stereotypes is also really important because it can tell us about what those kinds of updating mechanisms might be. What are the inputs or influences in our society that might shift our minds? It can tell us both about psychological mechanisms like cognitive dissonance, for instance, but also more broadly, things like norm conformity, social movements, for instance, that can tell us a little bit more broadly about these different levels that were already mentioned that might change our minds as well. Now, those are both sort of more basic science reasons why we would want to understand attitudes, why we would want to understand change. But being at Kellogg, we also have to talk a little bit about application. And so I think it's really important to think about change in our attitudes and stereotypes, also because of how it can help our organizations and our policies keep pace with and update in response to those changes in our attitudes. So if you think, for instance, about all the social tumultuousness that's happened just around gay rights, trans rights, for instance, we want to be sure that our organizations and our policies are keeping pace with those kinds of changes so that they don't get left behind in kind of outdated policies or outdated ideas. Moreover, we can even think about how we might motivate organizations to actually be the ones that are at the front of change. Right? How do we inspire organizations to adopt new policies, adopt new practices that in turn feed back and continue to change our attitudes? So those are also applied reasons why we might care about how and why our attitudes and our stereotypes change. Now, those might seem like kind of ambitious goals. We have both basic science, we have applied reasons to care about this research program. And yet, even though these ideas and these hopes for that kind of research program have been in psychology and in sociology for a really long time, to date, we've largely studied these questions in relatively limited ways. So specifically, we typically study change in our attitudes and our stereotypes within a single individual mind, usually just one person measured before and after some kind of targeted intervention. We often also only study attitude change towards one social target group, just race attitudes, just gender attitudes, just sexual orientation attitudes, for instance. Usually only using a single measure, so just feeling thermometers or Likerts, for instance, and often over a relatively short time scale. So measuring your attitudes, I bring you into the lab, I give you an intervention, I measure them sometimes just 5 minutes later, maybe a day later, at best a month later. So my work advances on all 4 of these scales. Specifically, as was already mentioned, I really take seriously the call to understand attitude and stereotype change as it unfolds across multiple levels of analysis. So of course, we still care about individual humans a little bit, but we also care about the sort of organizations or meso-societies that they're nested within, so they're groups. And especially we care about the broadest macro level. So how is our society on average shifting in what it thinks and feels about groups around them? I also take a multi-group target approach. So I triangulate across multiple different group targets so we can figure out the features of different groups that might be more or less likely to change. We can figure out what is it about race attitudes in particular, for instance, that might make them more or less malleable over time. I take a multi-measure approach, so I don't just look at our feeling thermometers and what people are actually saying they think about these groups, but also look at more hidden or implicit measures, as well as large-scale patterns of language use, to really understand how change might happen some places and still persist in others. And finally, most of my work takes a really long-term perspective. So you'll see this across the 2 parts of my talk. I begin by just looking across the relatively short time scale of just a decade. But in our most recent work, we've spanned to look across 200 years of how these social opinions and social representations are changing as well. So that's exciting for me. So I'm going to dive in to a 2-part talk to present this kind of multi-measure, multi-group, multi-level, long-term timescale on attitude and stereotype change. In the first part, I'm going to focus just on contemporary attitudes, specifically contemporary implicit attitudes and how they've changed across the past 14 years towards various different group targets. To understand a little bit more about why some of those attitudes are changing and why others are not, we do need to expand the number of attitudes we study as well as the time scale we study. And so in part 2, I'll expand to look across longer timescales of 200 years of English language book text and many more social groups to understand where and why change might be happening. Okay, I'm also going to pause and say, hopefully some of you have had some food now, so you're additionally energized. You can jump in with questions. From here on out, it's you talking, hopefully just as much as me talking. So please interrupt me. Again, we're at Kellogg. This is the place where hand raising is a very normal situation. Okay. Great. Any questions right now? Okay, great. Well, hopefully you'll continue to be inspired with questions. All right, so as I mentioned, these questions of change in our attitudes and our stereotypes have been at the center of our fields for a really long time. And over this time, we have documented a lot of evidence that people change. But so far, for the past 70 years or so, people have been documenting these changes on what I was calling explicit attitudes. Specifically, we measure people and what they think and feel about social groups by giving you a survey. So how much do you think about Black, or how much do you feel, how warmly do you feel towards Black people? How warmly do you feel towards old people, gay people, and so on? Now, these explicit attitudes have told us a lot about how change can happen. It's told us which attitudes might change, what kind of interventions work best, who is most sort of susceptible to those changes. So liberals, for instance, are more susceptible to our interventions about sort of typical liberal movements. But obviously, we still have a lot to learn. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, I want it.
Keep my question for later. So one of the things about surveys is that people sometimes give you the answer that they think is totally acceptable.
Yep.
And so, and I wonder to what extent sometimes you see some kind of change. So the belief has not changed, but the way in which it's presented has changed. So for instance, I'm no longer a racist.
Yep.
I hate Black people.
Yep.
Now I hate criminals.
Yep.
Criminals have
Yep.
become whistle for
Yep.
Black people, right? I don't
Totally.
hate gays, but I hate trans people,
Yep.
right? So it's kind of, you could have attitudes that are actually not changed but get disguised.
Yes.
Because I've just chose another word to kind
Describe.
of
Yep.
express my feelings and discriminate.
I love it. That's part 2 of the talk, and it's the last slide, and it's a new theory I've developed with Mark Katzenbuehler. Yeah, so I think just to preface a little bit, what that will show is exactly what you're saying, that a lot of the way people maintain, especially their explicit attitudes over time, is by transferring prejudice between groups, so what we call a replacement mechanism. So that's the gay to trans mechanism that you pointed out. But there's also a second mechanism, which is the reproducibility mechanism, where we put it under new labels. So that's the Black to criminal mechanism that you pointed out. And we think those 2 paths are explaining why we see at a deeper level, implicit level, more persistence than we might see in these kinds of surveys. You also mentioned a perfect transition to my next slide, which is that the reason the reason why we can't stop here with just studying explicit attitudes is that so much of what is going on in our mind and our society is implicit. So you mentioned one of the reasons is that many times people are unwilling to report on their actual attitudes, right? We might be less inclined to actually discuss our racial attitudes for fear of appearing prejudiced, for instance. Another reason why explicit attitudes can't tell us the whole story is because we're often even unaware of the attitudes to begin with. It's really hard to just like sit in a dark room and be like, what do I think about old people? What do I think about old people? And know exactly how you feel, because they can be not super well elaborated, for instance. So because of both this unwillingness to report and this unawareness of the content, we scientists have turned to more indirectly documenting these implicit attitudes and beliefs that people hold. So my work is not tied to any one way that we might measure these implicit attitudes, and I'll show you 2 very different ways across the 2 parts. But by far the most common way that psychologists have measured these implicit attitudes is, any psychologists in the room want to tell me? Yes, Victoria. The IAT, the implicit association test, which has been around since the 1990s. And basically the idea is to use reaction time or speed for you to make paired categorizations. So for instance, bad and young and good and old, and compare that to the opposite, where we would do bad and old and good and young. And we assume that reaction time tells us something about how automatically associated 2 concepts are in your mind and in your environment. So from the moment that this kind of measurement was introduced in psychology, there's been an enduring and burning question front of mind for both researchers and practitioners. That is the question, can these implicit attitudes change? So intuitively, you can think, and many of the original creators of this test, my advisor among them, thought implicit attitudes could never be changed. They themselves couldn't control their responses, their speed of responding on the task. So how on earth could we expect this to actually shift in response to an intervention, for instance? Turns out, however, there was a new revolution of scientists, a new revolution of ideas since those early notions. And implicit attitudes actually are not these kinds of cognitive monsters we might think about that they thought about originally, this kind of like enduring monster that sits around in our mind. But in fact, implicit attitudes have the possibility of transformation. Specifically from careful targeted interventions, so exposure to a counter stereotype, for instance, we've seen that implicit attitudes can change over the short term within an individual mind. So if I give a single person a kind of intervention, that counter stereotypical exposure, for instance, I can see immediate shifts. Of course, that does leave open the question, the one that's going to motivate the second part of the talk. What about that duration of the change? Is it just a 24-hour Band-Aid? Or is it something that's actually shifting the contents of your mind, actually shifting the associations? And moreover, is that happening at the broadest level of our society? Is it just a single individual mind, or could we see actual shifts happening in what people on average tend to feel? So my work was the first to measure this kind of long-term societal change in our implicit attitudes. And I'm going to do that by using this large-scale data set called Project Implicit, which is collected data on our implicit and explicit attitudes for 14 years, from about 2007 through to 2020, consistently, literally minute by minute, millisecond by millisecond for the IAT, towards 6 different social target groups. So again, that's about triangulating our inferences across these groups that have different features. Now, this is rich time series data that's going to have many unique features, such as temporal autocorrelations that you might remember about from your multiple regression classes, where we have dependencies in the data that we need to account for. And so to analyze it, I'm going to use the tools of time series models, specifically autoregressive integrated moving average, or ARIMA models. Now, ARIMA models work by iteratively updating your predictions over time. So this would be like me predicting how you feel towards old people today in November. Yeah, great, time, that's how it works. Today in November from your preferences in October and your preferences in September. Wow, I feel very unconfident with how months work. And by using this kind of iterative updating approach, we can get a better non-linear understanding about how change might be unfolding, right? We're not fitting a strict linear model. Instead, we're allowing it to evolve more dynamically. We can also account for those temporal dependencies in the data. We can account for possible patterns of seasonality, so rises and falls across some months, for instance. And time series models are specifically designed to give us forecasts, which are essentially intuitive, almost effect size-like estimates that tell us how much change could occur in the future should past trends continue from the past. So when I started these analyses, both that approach of time series models and the project implicit data were new in our field. So I'm actually going to start by grounding your understanding in what we see in our explicit attitudes, which are those things that we would consciously report on those surveys, for instance. So just to orient you to the graphs, on the x-axis is time. It goes all the way up to 2025. It is not 2025 yet. I will just be showing you forecasts as well. And on the y-axis are explicit preference scores. So higher scores indicate that you like the more dominant or stereotypically preferred group. So for instance, a pro-straight preference would be a higher score. So across all 6 of those explicit attitudes, explicit sexual orientation, race, skin tone, age, disability, and body weight attitudes, we find decreases over time. The fastest change that we see are in explicit sexuality, race, and skin tone attitudes, which have dropped by between 75 to 98% over just 14 years. We see slower, but nonetheless notable change in explicit age, disability, and body weight attitudes. But what is most important from all of these data is this across-the-board movement of explicit attitudes, as well as the relative differences with faster movement in race attitudes than in age attitudes, for instance, matches up with what we see on representative social surveys. So things like Pew, General Social Survey, and so on. And that's really important because it tells us that even though the data set and the method are relatively new in psychology, the fact that they're mapping on with kind of gold standards tells us that it's not going to be something idiosyncratic or unique about just this data set. And so we can use that data to ask and answer our burning question, which is what of those implicit attitudes? What of those cognitive monsters? Is it going to be true that these implicit attitudes are sort of enduring in our mind, despite the fact we're seeing changes in explicit attitudes, to see this more persistence over time in implicit attitudes? Now, the cognitive monster idea is one very robust hypothesis that we can think of in the area of psychology. But there's another idea that was just starting to emerge as I did these analyses, which is that implicit attitudes, far from being these cognitive monsters, might actually reflect a little bit more about our contexts. So they reflect the kinds of associations that are embedded in our environment. And that means that if those contexts are able to be changed, which we know they are because we've seen changes, for instance, in women's representation in science, we've seen Black Lives Matter movements, we've seen changes in protests, for instance, then the attitudes that are tied to those contexts should also be able to change. So this sets up the alternative hypothesis of maybe implicit attitudes look just like explicit attitudes. Maybe they too have also changed over time. So here, the only thing I've changed, sorry, I know there's a little bit a strange lag between slides, but it's for dramatic effect. So the only thing I've changed here is just the y-axis. So now we're showing the IATD scores, which is just that relative difference in the speed of associating concepts on the IAT test. But again, higher scores indicate more stereotypical preferences. And I'm going to focus your attention on the bottom row, so implicit age, disability, and body weight attitudes. Across these three attitudes, we see no change. So implicit age, disability, and body weight attitudes have not changed at all, to the extent that those forecasts, the shaded areas in the far this side of the graph, suggest it would take more than 200 years for those attitudes to ever touch neutrality. And it's worth pausing to remember that if we had stopped here, we would have concluded just what all previous researchers had concluded, which is that implicit attitudes are some kind of cognitive monster. They're enduring in our mind. There's no way for them to change. But that's why it's important to take that multi-group approach, right? To look across and triangulate across multiple group targets, because it turns out that actually when we expand our focus to also look at implicit race and skin tone attitudes, we see that implicit attitudes there have changed by about 25 to 26%, with the lower bounds of those forecasted confidence intervals suggesting they could touch neutrality between 15 to 20 years, should those past trends continue. By far the most rapid change we see, as you might have expected, is in implicit sexual orientation attitudes, which have dropped by a whopping 65%. And the lower bound of that forecasted confidence interval, if past trends have continued, should actually have already passed, because I stopped these data collections in the end of 2020. So already we should be well past a pro-gay preference. Whether that's happened, you'll have to stay tuned. I have a planned data collection and analysis next year, so look out for the paper. But really what I want to say is that these implicit attitudes on the top row are telling us a new story, which is that implicit attitudes can change, largely because of these kinds of yoking to our contexts. Now, there are many features that you can point out that distinguish those changing from unchanging attitudes, and I'm sure we can all discuss many of them. One of the most important that we've shown in now multiple different lines of work is that those attitudes that are more likely to change are those attitudes that we as a society have made a priority to change and to discuss. Specifically, those attitude topics that we talk about more often in society are brought more front of mind and therefore more malleable and accessible targets for change and for persuasion. So implicit race, sexuality, and skin tone attitudes are way more likely to be targets of intervention, way more likely to be talked about around the dinner table, for instance, whereas implicit age, disability, and body weight attitudes are kind of taken for granted. It's just assumed that everyone feels negatively, and so there isn't as much debate, isn't as much prioritization. But more broadly than anything, again, what these results are pointing to is this new conclusion about the nature of implicit attitudes, which is that implicit attitudes can change, even at the level of our society, even over really long-term periods of about 14 years. Now, I hope that's already exciting for you, but maybe there are also questions. No, please. No, I hope you're inspiring others too on this side of the room to. Okay, great. I can shame some people in the room too.
I should shut up, but my curiosity gets the best of me. So I'm thinking in terms of personality type, factors, right? And openness in particular. And so possibility that people that are more open-minded, kind of being more susceptible to these trends. And their context is very important, right? Because maybe they didn't even realize that they were discriminating. Now they become aware enough that you have these change. But then there are people that are not open-minded, right? And so you could imagine that there is a breakdown of population into some fraction that is open-minded, some is not. And what would happen if the fraction of that is not open-minded would sort of never change, and then there is sort of a limit below which you cannot go? Is there any way that you have kind of other data that could be measuring these openness?
Totally. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. Or maybe I can't. Okay, I will skip ahead a few slides, but I will answer it now. So the question you're asking is basically who is changing, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. And two great proxies for openness are age and political orientation. So if your idea is true, then younger people should be changing faster than older people. Liberals should be changing faster than conservatives. That's exactly what we see in the data. It's probably due to some sort of openness to experience. Probably also those are the people most likely to be embedded in those kinds of contexts that are changing. So young people and liberals are more likely to be going to the protests that are the things that are changing race and sexual orientation attitudes. So it's all in line with that same idea. Whether it's actually openness to experience or some other personality correlate with those demographic groups, we don't yet have data on, but I think it's a super interesting question. Yeah. In the back, Jane.
So for the same person, so the person's changing.
Yeah.
Both implicitly and also explicitly. Which one changed first?
Great question. Yep.
You fake it until you make it.
Yeah.
Or you have to change inside first and you express it.
Yep. The shocking answer is when we look, so we don't have individual level data in this. So this is all societal level data. So it's on average, how are people changing? And there's a lot of mechanisms going on there. One of them is individual attitude change, and we're able to parcel that out analytically. But I can answer your question at a societal level, like as a society, which one's changing first, implicit or explicit? How are they related over time? The shocking answer is actually when we fit these kind of cross-legged models, so you can actually see, is this time series going first or this time series going first? They don't seem to be that related, with one exception that I'll mention. So what that tells us is that probably implicit and explicit attitudes are changing for different reasons, like through different mechanisms. It's not that I first change my associations in my mind and then I change what I say. It's also not true that I fake it till I make it or anything like that. It seems that probably what's going on is implicit attitudes are changing because of those context variables, and explicit attitudes are changing probably for a different reason, which I would say is more about social norms and like values and not being able to express prejudice anymore. And those might be kind of divorced, and that's why we're not seeing much relationship over time. The one exception is race attitudes, which I don't have a great explanation for. And actually there, the change is more that implicit change happens first and explicit change follows from it. And so that would go to this idea of like, you're actually changing your associations or you're changing your context, which in turn is changing what you say. Yeah, but it's a great question. And like at the individual level, I think is a super important one to address. So I'm gonna breeze through, and you're just gonna have to trust me for these next 5 slides. We address all sorts of threats to interpretation. We account for sample change. We account for repeat test takers, possible regression to the mean. We account for the most common concern of this is a self-selected volunteer respondent. Turns out it's not. So we can address this more robust question, which is the question of who is changing. And as was already kind of alluded to, that answering that question of who is changing, what demographic groups are changing, can give us a lot of insight into why certain attitudes might be changing. Specifically, if we find that change is only happening in just some people, that would tell us that that change is probably from a demographic motivation, right? So something about this kind of openness to experience, perhaps, or other kinds of SDO, or any of those kinds of motivations that are just affecting some kind of people in our society. In contrast, if change is happening across everyone, that tells us that it's probably more likely to be a kind of macro level environment, a kind of ocean that everyone is swimming in, and so everyone is going to ultimately change. I've kind of already given away some of the answer, but actually the answer I gave would suggest that everything we see is this just some people pattern, but that's only for age and political orientation. In fact, most of the data we see is in this everyone bucket. So we see widespread change across gender, no gender differences, so both men and women changing or remaining stable in parallel. We also see no education differences, no religion differences, no sexual orientation differences, and Black-white racial differences only on Black-white racial attitudes. We also see no change across geography, or no differences across geography. So for sexual orientation, for instance, we find that every single US state has moved towards less bias or lighter colors on this scale. In other work in which we're looking at gender stereotypes across countries, we've also been able to show that most countries are changing in parallel. But again, as was already mentioned, there are two really notable and interesting exceptions that tell us something again about these kinds of mechanisms of change. And that is that we see both age and political differences. So younger people are moving faster than older people, and liberals here in blue are moving faster than conservatives here in red. And that's telling us something about those unique psychologies or social experiences that younger versus older and liberal versus conservative people are experiencing in the US. Any questions on, yes, great. Now that you can see the data.
No, it's fascinating, and maybe I'm reading too much, but in some of the graphs that show change, there seems to be something that is kind of stable until 2011, 12, 13.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in
Yep.
kind of, well, in a sense, it was not only about race, but it was also a situation in which females were very involved, queer people were very involved, and kind of that changed a lot of context, I think, and all
Yep.
the kind of rallies and demonstrations and protests. Is that reading too much, or is there a way that?
Yeah.
What
happened in the 2012 is actually exactly where that inflection point right here happens, especially for conservatives we see. It's not entirely clear, and a lot of this would be post hoc reasoning, of course. Some of it might be, so that's Obama's second election, and there is some work in political science that suggests that the first election might not be enough evidence that a culture is actually changing. It's the second election that shows us, it kind of convinces us, we're like, oh, actually, the fact that we re-elected this person tells us that the majority, it's kind of a very strong signal of a social norm. The majority of people believe enough of X to re-elect this person. So whether it's, and also like this was, Obama really stood for same-sex marriage, for instance. He was the one who brought in Obergefell, et cetera, et cetera. So whether that's the key signal that happens there, unclear. I can tell you, and also because we don't have data too far back before then, it's hard to kind of do what you would need for causal inference, which is this like parallel trends assumption. I can tell you a little bit more about one other interesting inflection point that we see, which is this bump that happens for race in 2016. Only amongst mostly amongst conservatives, mostly amongst Republican states, especially targeted around certain kinds of speeches from a presidential candidate that was elected at that time. Only in the attitudes that he targeted. So we see it in race. We also see that bump happen exactly at the time he targeted a disabled New York Times reporter. And we see it exactly at a time when he targeted Rosie O'Donnell for being overweight. So we think that we actually in the paper call these Trump bumps towards attitudes. And I think that's one indication, again, of this interaction with context or interaction with media environments and our effect on our attitude. And we're able to do the kind of double difference and differences approach to actually triangulate of where that might be happening. But if anyone else has other ideas of what might have gone on in 2012, we do see that inflection point pretty consistently. So contact me afterwards because we're still trying to partial it out. Yeah, Jenny.
Can you help me understand kind of the forecast? I mean, it's already
Yep.
saying the negative for sexuality.
For sexuality, yeah.
Kind of, is that a rebirth? Like,
yeah. It is showing that liberals on average in the United States from about 2018 onwards show a pro-gay preference, which like, yay for gays, but whether you can see it's actually starts to level, there is a little bit of a drop, but that's probably just random noise. It actually starts to level out around the 0 line. So I think that what we'll see next is not what the forecasts are saying is like based on past trends. This entire past trend, we would expect a movement downwards. But if we were to keep the window tighter, the forecasts say it would stabilize around the neutral point. And I think that's probably more likely that what's happening amongst liberals is more of I don't want to have a preference anymore. Yeah. Yeah, Abdul.
I'm really curious to hear more of your thoughts about the specific context that you think
Yeah.
is driving this, and maybe it's coming later. But I was wondering because I think you just showed that there was like across different countries kind of going down similarly.
Yep.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about like geographical variation that might explain this, and if not, my thought, I'm sure many people ask you this about like social media and
Yeah.
that has an impact.
Yeah, social media, I think, and I will get to this in a few slides. I think like our information ecosystems are the kind of context I'm talking about. I think nations might be too diffuse. I think we need a little bit more of a local context, which is why we're seeing more of a difference in the demographics than we are across states, for instance. So I think it needs to be more like your information ecosystem than it is about like what country you're in or what value you're in, if that helps. And I'll get to the information ecosystem in just a second. Okay, great. So, great. Oh, wow, that was a moment of like, basically what this is saying is despite those two differences in political orientation and in age, these sources of our implicit attitudes appear to be impressively widespread across people and places. So this again is going towards a theoretical model that our implicit attitudes seem to be maybe uniquely tied to our context, and as those contexts shift, so too do our implicit attitudes. Very slow. Okay, so 3 key takeaways before I dive in a little bit to our part 2, because I want to make sure that we get through all of that new exciting historical data. So the first is simply that far from being these cognitive monsters, our implicit attitudes can change, even over the long term, even at the broadest level of our society. Just as important to knowing that they can change is remembering that they do not have to. So change is not inevitable. Implicit age, disability, and body weight attitudes have not shifted at all over 14 years. When change does happen, so it seems to be especially for those attitudes that we're prioritizing in our society, when change happens, it is impressively widespread, which again is telling us to pull the lever of our context, perhaps rather than individual hearts and minds, when it comes to trying to change our broader attitudes. Now, a little bit to Abdo's point, this idea of let's just change the context can seem extremely insurmountable, right? That seems like the broadest level of analysis as it is. So one of my thesis students actually tried to just bite off a little piece of, can we show any kind of proof of concept that it is possible to change these kinds of information ecosystems and see shifts in our attitudes in response? And we were particularly motivated to answer this question by looking at one unique point of data, which is this unique rise. Granted, this is an explicit preference, but this unique rise that we see in explicit anti-elderly attitudes since about 2016, 2017. Now, one of the reasons that we think this might be happening, any ideas? What was going on? What's the like rhetoric currently? If I also told you one other key piece of data, which is that these bumps, this increase, is especially strong amongst young liberals.
I mean, it might be associated with like older people tend to be more part of the conservative movement, so it's really with the young liberals.
Yep.
I also guess I had a question I was going to ask.
Oh, great.
But I couldn't think of the words to ask it. Do you think that, as well as correlating to these kind of openness attitudes between like liberal and conservative, do you think there is some kind of like explicit in-group preferences? Since people of these like traditionally discriminated against groups are often more part of like, the liberal group?
Totally.
That could be going on as well.
Totally. I think it's part of what's going on. I think if that were the only thing that were going on, we would have also seen differences, for instance, across sexual orientation itself, like the actual in-group identity itself, and we don't. So I think it's probably liberals might perceive, let's say, gay people as more part of the liberal identity and therefore have a kind of like two-way in-group identity. But if it's only about in-group identity, then we probably would have expected gay people to be the ones who are changing the fastest and straight people to be a little bit slower. And we're not seeing that much of a difference. Yeah. So yes, this idea though, for your answer to my question, this idea that older people are kind of more outdated, more conservative, getting in the way of social change was coined in this idea that you might have heard of, the okay boomer phenomenon of like, older person gets in the way of social change, is not in tune with what's going on in society, and the young millennial says, or the young Gen Zer says, okay, boomer. So that's what we think is actually going on here. And what's been really cool is we can say, okay, that's part of this social media ecosystem. And we can see, okay, if we give people Twitter threads that challenge these kinds of media ecosystems, or we give them short narratives that challenge these kinds of ecosystems, and we say, actually, it turns out, for instance, I'll just show you what some of the content of the intervention was. Turns out that older people are uniquely poised for social activism because when they retire, they have a whole bunch of time that they can engage in social activism. And there are all these stories of older people who are engaging in social activism. So we're explicitly trying to challenge these ideas about the sort of source of these okay boomer beliefs. And we show that compared to baseline, both liberals and conservatives in these okay boomer challenging conditions show decreases in their explicit anti-elderly attitudes, as well as their explicit okay boomer beliefs explicitly. So that's telling us that even though changing the context seems like this really high ask, it could be possible to just do these kinds of micro level interventions that are able to kind of shift our social minds. All right. So that's part one, and really the takeaway I hope you are getting is that there is an importance of the context of our broader ecosystems that we're all swimming in that can explain some of our changes in our contemporary implicit and explicit attitudes. But again, to Abdo's point, one of the important things we need to do is actually think about what is context. Let's see if we can quantify it. And there are many people who have talked about context. Amongst them is the sociologist that you might have heard of called Emile Durkheim, who in the 1800s proposed this idea of collective representations. So representations or ideas and beliefs that are widely shared across people and places. And for him, the key with these collective representations was that they become shared, they become collective through language. So through the consistent patterns of words that we use in our everyday news media, our books, our conversations, and so on. So if we want to understand how context or collective representations are changing, then ultimately we need to study how it's changing in language. Now, as you know, there are many ways that we might study these kinds of language patterns. This like natural language processing over just the past year has become like one of the hottest topics in social sciences. And I'm actually going to be using probably one of our more basic, or some might say outdated, but I think still has extreme utility in studying these kinds of questions, which is the tool of word embeddings. So how many people have heard of word embeddings before? See, this is even an indication. Like if I were to, well, also the audience, but if I were to have asked this like 2 years ago, I would have got maybe one hand. So that's awesome. So for those who don't know, word embeddings, really briefly at a high level, I want you to understand them by first imagining a large cloud of meaning. So formally, this is a high dimensional semantic space of meaning. But within this cloud, you can imagine a vector or a string of numbers to represent the meaning of every single word in our language. So within that cloud, there's going to be a vector to represent the meaning of the word office and man and kitchen and so on. And the way that we position these vectors in that cloud is by looking at how the words are used. So by looking at a word's semantic context. So what words co-occur together. And we expect that words like office and man are going to co-occur more often and so should be placed more closely in that cloud of word meaning. So once we've achieved that optimal representation where all the words that occur often together also occur often together in our cloud of meaning, then we can look at the relationships between those word vectors to get an index into those kinds of stereotypical associations in our semantic space of meaning. So specifically, we can look at cosine similarities between these word vectors to understand, for instance, how overlapping is woman to kitchen versus woman to office, for instance. And what's been really exciting is over the past, I guess Eileen published her paper, that was a long time ago now, but since that early paper, we've shown that in fact you can use these kinds of measures to study attitudes as well. So the associations we pull out from word embeddings map on to the same kinds of associations that we can pull out in the implicit association test that I showed you in part one. So in fact, when we do this systematically, it turns out that across about 55 different topics, the correlation is about 0.45 between our attitude measures and our implicit measures, or sorry, our implicit measures and our language measures, which is again telling us this really exciting sort of validation of using these methods so that we can expand the study of our attitudes, of our collective representations across unprecedented scales. And particularly for me, as someone interested in change, I'm really interested in expanding the study of collective representations across time. So in the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about our paper where we expand the study of attitudes and stereotypes across 200 years using English language book text from about 8 million English language books, or about 500 billion words. And I'm going to expand not only in scope across time, but also the number of groups that we study, given the importance we saw of triangulating across those multiple targets. So I'm going to look not only at gender, but also and race, but also at sexual social class, age, and body weight as well. I'm going to expand in a third key direction, which is that not only expanding across time and across the number of groups, but I'm also going to allow us to step beyond what we typically do in the social sciences, which is to say, I'm interested in the office versus kitchen stereotype. And then we go in and we look for that stereotype. Instead, I'm going to allow us to discover what I call emergent stereotypes. So which words of all possible words emerge as most associated with men? Which words of all possible words emerge as most associated with women, for instance? And that gives us a really unique opportunity to actually understand more of the qualitative data, the qualitative stereotype content that might be shifting across time. So as you can imagine, from all of these directions of expansion across time, number of groups, emergent stereotypes, we have a lot of data. So I don't even want you to try and read all the words, or you can, and then go and tell your eye doctor, like, all good. But if you end up reading this, what I want you to really take away is just that these data are provided openly so that people like yourselves can go in and do these qualitative deep dives into specific changes in those stereotype content. And we ourselves have, for instance, already done this with the stereotype of fat, for instance, to see how it's shifted from referring more towards wealth and prosperity and positivity in the early 1800s to referring more towards the health connotations following the obesity epidemic and representations, for instance.
Looks like Native American and Hispanic very specific meaning nowadays.
Yep.
I wonder if they were used in the 1800s. So I imagine that you have sort of a dictionary of things.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We use historical synonyms of those group targets. Yep, great. And I'll get a little bit to semantic drift concerns later. Okay, so for the purposes of time, I'm just going to pull out some key quantitative data. Specifically, I'm going to look at the average changes in these trait content by taking our list of traits, so 600 traits from able to zestful, their associations with a given group, so how associated are those traits with women in the 1800s, 1980s, and 1990s, for instance, so that I can then see how correlated are these trait spaces across time. And when I do that over just successive decades, so just 10 years, I find that the correlations are shockingly, to a social scientist, shockingly high. So sitting at about 0.82. And that tells us that over 10 years, these trait spaces are indeed quite similar. Importantly, however, we have lower correlations over longer time. So when I take the whole time span of 200 years, the correlation is now down to about 0.52. And that tells us that there is some shifting in those broader trait spaces that we use to describe social groups over time. We can also look to see which groups are changing more than others. And specifically, we find that there's the highest stability, so the least amount of change over time, the highest correlations over time for gender and social class groups. So men, women, rich, and poor all show a lot of blue in their correlograms, which means that they're very correlated across time. In contrast, we see a lot more change in our what would be called sort of socially constructed identities. Those are race, so Hispanic, Native American, Asian, and Black. Here we see a lot more red, which tells us that these groups, which again, Jim Sidenius would say are these kinds of culturally constructed identities to serve certain functions over time, show a lot more shift in their stereotype content over time. You had a question?
Yeah, so the distribution of outdoors have changed over time.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
Not there, or maybe you can.
Can we? Yep.
The writings of today from the writings of 100 years ago,
Yep.
where it was the specific population
Yep.
that was writing.
Totally. It depends on what inference you wanted to make, right? So the inference I want to make is about what on average are people receiving as inputs in society. In the 1800s, what people on average were receiving as inputs in society was controlled by just a select few. Part of what we're measuring and part of what we want to measure is the change over time and who gets to control the rhetoric. The fact then that we see such stability here, for instance, tells us that certain kind of groups are in their stereotype content are relatively immune to those kinds of shifts in who's controlling the rhetoric. So men, for instance, were stereotyped very similarly by the male white writers of the 1800s as they are by the more diffuse authorships of today. In contrast, there might be something, and one of the forces we think is going on is the shift in population of writers that is revising what we think about certain groups, but not others. Yeah, so it's great. It's part of the mechanism, in fact. Yeah.
There are the plans for similar analysis with the books being used.
Yes. There are plans, slow plans, but they are there. Yes. Yeah. So we have a data set of newspapers from 1790 through to now that actually Sylvan in the corner is helping me analyze right now. Yep. I will also say we do repeat these analyses with genre balanced text corpora as well. So because it's not only changes in authorship, but changes in the relative proportion of fiction and nonfiction text, for instance, we're able to control for that because we don't think that's as much of the mechanism we care about. And we find the same conclusions with those genre balanced. But yes, newspapers are super interesting. In contemporary data, we're also really interested in time series with, say, Reddit data or with Twitter data, for instance, to see how, we can think about books as very different kinds of media sources. Thanks. Yeah.
One possibility that I think would also be interesting is textbooks, and in particular,
ooh, interesting.
Textbooks, because
yeah,
we are seeing how much certain groups want to control what goes
yes.
into books. And so if you are trying to think in terms of what the powerful want their subjects to see, how
yeah.
they want to see the world, that would be a very nice place to look.
That would be very interesting. Yeah, and also the revisionist history question too, I think would be really interesting. Cool, thanks. All right, so again, you're just gonna have to trust me for reasons of time. We address a whole bunch of threats to interpretation. Amongst them are some of the ones I've already mentioned. So there is one that I haven't mentioned that is worth noting that's particularly a concern in text, which is that this idea of polysemy. A given word can refer to multiple meanings. So rich, for instance, not just rich people, but also refers to rich food, rich land, and so on. We rule this out by making sure we're triangulating across the dictionary so we get to that group-specific intended meaning. We do. A second concern is about semantic drift. So traits themselves, also group labels themselves, change over time. We rule that out. That's not what's going on here. It seems to be above and beyond this idea of semantic drift. And lastly, we also have this question of sample change in these genres of text. Again, we rule this out by replicating it with a genre balanced corpus over time. So that tells us that across these 200 years, we have evidence of change in the semantic or stereotype content. But hopefully the psychologists, who I think are mostly clustered at this side of the room, could tell me that stereotypes are not just about content and semantics. They also contain a really key piece of information, which is valence. Positivity and negativity. And what's been really interesting is when we look beyond just the kind of surface level of the actual words used to are associated with given groups to the latent meaning of valence, we actually find much more evidence of stability across the 200 years. So 9 out of those 14 groups show no significant slopes in their time series over time. There are, of course, the 5 exceptions, including one I've already mentioned. Yep. One I've already mentioned, so fat, which went from more positive representations to more negative representations, exactly as we would have expected. But taken more generally, what this is telling us is that despite those large-scale changes we saw in the semantic or sort of manifest superficial content, we see more evidence of the stability of valence over time. Now, at first blush, this might be a little bit hard to wrap your head around, right? How can you have both change and stability within the exact same group? But this goes to an earlier conversation we were having that it actually might be that these two forces, this change in content and the stability in valence, are actually feeding each other. Specifically, we have this new idea of what we're calling the stigma stability framework, where people are using these joint mechanisms that I mentioned of replacement and reproducibility so that they can reproduce the latent negativity, the thing that they really care about, stigmatizing a group, by changing the superficial content itself. Right? So essentially, we could think of a given trait, like being lazy, for instance, might fall out of fashion, and I can no longer describe Hispanic people as lazy, for instance. But a new trait may come to take its place that has the same latent negativity, but is just now seen as more socially acceptable to say. So maybe it's just helpless or poor or something like that. So, or what? Drug dealer, exactly. And I think this is actually a really interesting idea. The dog whistling that you mentioned earlier of like the group labels themselves changing over time. So it's not just the traits that are replacing, but it's actually how we like codify or code to refer to different groups. I think it's a really interesting mechanism as well. Okay, so the first takeaway from part 2 is methodological. Turns out we can measure these large-scale collective representations even over 200 years if we use our kind of text-based approaches. And we can do so with validity because it seems that these two kinds of measures are indeed linked in pretty robust ways. Because of that validity, we also have an empirical takeaway, which is that we can now use these large-scale records, both qualitative and quantitative, to deeply understand how specific groups are changing. For instance, how has the representation of fatness changed over time? but also to see more quantitatively how has valence versus, for instance, semantic content changed in different ways, and how are they feeding into each other. And for me, that's our most exciting new future direction, which is really deeply trying to understand what are those dynamics between the various levels of analysis, even within a given group stereotype. Okay, so because you guys have been relatively quiet, we will have some time for questions at the end. So I'll just close up with a broader takeaway, which is that, again, my research program is really focused on this question of how and why we change our attitudes and stereotypes towards social groups. And I really take seriously this idea that change is, for NICO, perfect, complex, right? Change, therefore, needs to be addressed in all of its complexity across multiple levels of analysis, across multiple group targets, across multiple measures, implicit and explicit and naturalistic language, and to the extent possible across the longest timescales that could actually be used to see cultural change should it exist. So through this complex approach, I've provided us with new insights into our implicit and our explicit attitudes, showing that far from being these cognitive monsters, implicit attitudes can change, even over the long term, even at the level of our society. When it comes to why they might be changing or the kind of lever we might want to pull to initiate future change, I pointed out that it seems that the broadest macro level of our society is the most important locus to try and intervene on. That also forces us to look at the most macro level of our society, the most collective means of our society, which is our language, and what our hidden patterns of language use and regularities in our language use can reveal about where change is and is not happening, perhaps with new insights into new targets for intervention going forward. So all of this is telling us not only about the kinds of methods and empirical records and maybe even some of the theoretical approaches, but ultimately also, again, being here at Kellogg, being here at Northwestern, where there are amazing applied researchers, is really trying to understand how do we use this more complete and complex understanding of change to inform the best interventions that will actually have some traction on pushing the needle, not just at the superficial level of what words we use to describe groups, but actually at the latent feelings that we feel about these groups. Because ultimately, it's only by looking back and documenting who we were 200 years ago, how far we've already come 200 years later, but also how far we have yet to go, that we can really harness the fact that as humans, we're capable of change. So with that, I will thank the people that have changed me, including my funders, and all of you for your attention. And we have, I think, still a few more minutes to have a broader discussion as well. So thanks so much. Yes, hi.
Yeah, I noticed that the object you have discussed about was like, for example, races, sexualities, which are like have been discussed over
Yep.
time, and a lot of information and debate on maybe newspapers,
Yep.
medias. I'm actually curious about if you have looked into any object that is more like neutral, like for example, the Midwest or a people that is part
Yep.
of it.
Yep,
Yeah.
definitely. And what would be your prediction? Because I'm curious. So I have the data, so I'm curious whether it maps on with what you would expect. It doesn't. You think neutral things don't change? Yeah. So it's a little bit of a curvilinear relationship with extremity, actually. So I think discussion is a separate topic that I'll mention in just a second. But things that people feel neutral about are actually probably the most open to those kinds of contextual shifts, right? So things like Midwestern people, like if, I don't know, like a Midwesterner committed a terrorist attack or something like that, like those attitudes could shift massively versus like if a liberal commits a terrorist attack. Because those are really well elaborated and extreme attitudes, they're less likely to be susceptible to like temporary shocks or to like a given intervention. And we actually find that we look at 72 different social groups in our most recent paper, and we find a curvilinear relationship with valence extremity. So the most positive groups don't really change at all. The most negative groups don't really change at all. The ones in the middle are kind of where we're seeing a little bit more of that movement. Interestingly, it's also that the ones in the middle, Midwesterner maybe being an interesting exception, the ones in the middle that are the most likely to change are the ones that are in the middle because of the kind of debate and like polarization around an attitude. So we actually see like on average, attitudes towards gay people are kind of in the middle because we have conservatives and then we have liberals. So there's a lot of debate about them. There's also a lot of polarization. So they end up kind of being neutral. Versus like, to give you an example, so like really positive groups are things like Christian, white. People don't really talk about those as identities that much. And so they also just don't really change. The really negative groups are a lot of disability groups, which are like super, super stable over time because like pretty much everyone just takes it for granted that we shouldn't like people with different abilities. So yeah, but it's a really interesting question. Victoria, yeah.
I was going to ask if because those extreme extremities are more closely moral identities, but then you said that because technology is being in the middle
because of polarization. Yep. Yeah. Right. I think it's right. I think the extremities are more about this kind of like discussion. And that's what we find in the data, that it's more about they're just not really discussed. Because basically those are the groups that I would say just like take as fact, whether you love or hate them. The groups that are in the middle and have maybe this, Curtis, has a little bit more to do with the moralization of an issue, which has like, I think a lot of dissent as involvement, like moralization happens when you feel strongly about an issue in contrast to someone else. And that's probably a feed in to why people are discussing it because they feel strongly about the issue, and also a feed into why it's kind of neutral. Yeah, so it could be that the latent variable explaining both of those features that I mentioned, of it seems to be neutral in valence and it also seems to be highly discussed, maybe it's moralization. We can look at that. Yeah, great questions. Yeah.
That's so great.
Thanks.
I was wondering if, I don't know if you could do this, but is there any way to look at like stereotypes? So you have stereotypes changing and there's certain words that become more associated with women over time. Maybe they're more positive. Is there a way to see where those stereotypes like started to originate, or kind of like maybe there's like a subgenre or something?
Yeah.
You can see like how the diffusion
Yeah.
stereotypes, it's going to succeed, and now it's more and more associated. So you kind of look at the mechanism, perhaps.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, say that again. Yes, I think this is a super interesting question. Yeah, so like diffusion of a stereotype, a specific stereotype content. I mean, theoretically, the methods are totally equipped to address that. We just haven't yet. So let's do it. And and also, I think another really interesting question that this makes me think of, and if anyone else wants to work on this, is, so I mentioned this idea, the question about like as prejudice towards gay people has gone down, prejudice towards trans people has gone up, this transfer of prejudice between group targets. One of the ways to test that is this kind of like the bleed over of specific stereotype content, where like a trait associated with gay people in the past, we can see that transfer happening through the kind of origin of a new stereotype towards trans people. And I really, right now it's basically the way we're showing evidence for this transfer of prejudice is just as one slope of valence goes down, another one seems to go up. But to actually get good inference on the mechanism is to actually show like the stereotype content itself is transferring to that group and not to another group like Midwesterners, for instance. So yeah, that's another future project. Great, maybe like 2 more. Curtis.
Yeah, I have a question about attitudes. Figure it out. Towards the beginning of your talk, people have like you were saying, people have their actual attitudes, but then sometimes we have different goals, or we say things that maybe aren't their actual attitudes. But I was reading a paper recently that included qualitative data, and it really gave me the impression that it's like, wow, people are ambivalent. They say things that are conflicting sometimes. And it's like, do people even have actual attitudes? Like, how do we distinguish between what's a goal that's somebody expressing something to meet a certain goal, or something that's their actual attitudes? Or it's like, maybe it's just all people saying things to meet certain goals. Like, I was wondering what your thoughts are.
I'm going to tell a really quick humorous story that does not answer your question, but this is like one of the most common questions that I get from psych audiences. And when I was writing my PhD dissertation, I had my dog on my lap next to me and I was typing away, and she just happened to put her paw on my keyboard at a crucial moment and somehow created, like, how you can highlight and create a comment around a word. So she highlighted the word attitude, created a comment, and it was just a question mark in it. And I just remember, like, middle of my PhD dissertation, looking down at my dog and being like, same girl, same. Like, so crucial. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the whole definitional space of attitudes like goes back to the 1950s. It's a really complex area of research. What I stand for is that attitudes are evaluations of target objects. Basically, it's any kind of target object that we can place on a positive negative continuum. That means that attitudes can be explicit. So that's a measurement question. They can be explicit if we ask about an evaluation on a survey. They can be implicit if we ask them more on indirect measures. They can be collective if we aggregate across a whole bunch of people and get on average, how do people place an object on a positive negative continuum? So that's my like super simplistic, that's the only thing I'm committed to. The degree to which attitudes are associated with goals and values and those kinds of things, I think is more about which types of attitudes we're talking about. So explicit, I think, are always filtered through goals and through our values. That's why we're seeing them change in very different ways for very different demographic groups. We also, interestingly, that correlation I showed you with our implicit attitudes in language of 0.45, the correlation of language and explicit attitudes is 0.1, which again is telling us that there's less of this collective culture going on. Explicit attitudes seem to be more filtered through values and goals. Implicit attitudes, by contrast, I think are much more about kind of this vacuous association space and this kind of cultural association space, and maybe less so about personal endorsement or anything like that. I know it's a simple understanding, but that's the only thing I feel like I commit to.